All right, Alexander, let's talk about what's going on in Kazakhstan. As we are doing this video, UK Foreign Secretary Liz Truss is speaking to the House, and she's upset with Russia. She's not only, from what I understand, it's not only about Russia Ukraine, but it's just about Russia meddling in general. I think there's a tendency right now to blame what's happening, and this is a weird one, to blame what's happening in Kazakhstan on Russia as some sort of Russian meddling, Russian regime change. I say that because I was also watching Fox News, and I forgot which one of I don't know if it was Hannity or Laura Ingraham, but they also threw out there. They were talking to Mike Pompeo, so it was Laura Ingraham, and they were talking about the Olympics in China, and they kind of threw out there that, Russia is meddling in Kazakhstan in some sort of reverse regime change kind of deal. Anyway, I bring that up because obviously the West is looking to spin their own narrative as to what's going on in Kazakhstan. We have Maria Zakharova, the spokeswoman for the foreign ministry. She said, and I quote, "We consider the recent events in a friendly country to be a foreign-inspired attempt to use armed and trained groups of people forcibly to undermine the security and integrity of the state." Alexander, we have CSTO peacekeepers who have been moved into the country as well. That's the Collective Security Treaty Organization. Of course, under the guidance of Russia, they've been moved in as well. And finally, to wrap things up, Bitcoin took a massive hit, 15-20% down, because, Alexander, a lot of Bitcoin miners are located in Kazakhstan. And not only that, it is also a key country. You did a live stream on Locals the other day, and it is a key country to China as well. People may not be realizing that China also sees Kazakhstan as a very important country, especially when you're looking at the puzzle that is one belt, one road, and Eurasia. So a lot of moving parts, a lot of things going on, but the reason for the initial protests was the petroleum liquefied gas price hikes. What it's become now, you'll explain everything that is going on. But on the 2nd of January, we had those price hikes and people went onto the streets. And now we are today, 6th of January, and look at where we are. That's an important day, by the way, 6th of January. As well.
Well, can I just say? I mean, obviously there were protests, but a lot of people were very angry about the hikes on the price of liquefied petroleum gas. But clearly, what has been going on in Kazakhstan is quite different from just protests about some price hikes. I think it's now becoming increasingly clear that this was a concerted and organised attempt by someone to overthrow the government of Kazakhstan. Now, there have been problems within the government. I've discussed in previous programs and on my live stream that we talked about that there were clearly divisions between the current president, Tokayev, and the former president, Nazarbayev, who was trying to retain control of the security forces. And there's clearly been those kind of tensions. And there's also been some tensions between Nazarbayev, the long-standing leader of the country, and the Russians. That crisis has been resolved. Tokayev has won. He is now the winner against Nazarbayev has been ousted from all his posts. He's no longer chair of the Security Council, and all his people who were in charge of the security forces, they've all been sacked. But in the midst of this power struggle that was obviously underway, and if you like, seizing advantage of the unrest that was caused by the price hikes, someone seems to have used that as an opportunity to carry out an actual attempt to overthrow the government. And what has happened is that the government has survived. I mean, it's not over yet. There's still fighting going on in some places, especially in Almaty. But it's clear that the worst of the crisis is now over. The military is starting to assert control across the country, and the Russians are moving in to Kazakhstan. There's been this request from Tokayev to the Russians, nominally to the Collective Security Treaty Organization, but of course it's actually the Russians. The Russians are now deploying troops into Kazakhstan. They're not going there in vast numbers. I've heard the total number will be around 5,000. But the point is, they provide the psychological support to the government. They tell everybody within the military, the security services, the state bureaucracy, the police, that Tokayev has the backing of the Russians. And as a result, the military, which yesterday seemed paralyzed, has now been activated and is starting to take control of the situation in the cities. And we learn that in most of the cities, the situation is now stabilizing. In Almaty, there is still fighting going on with these organized militia groups. But it looks as if this attempt to overthrow the government has miscarried. Now, let's get back to mistrust. Let's get back to what people are saying on Hannity and all those and Laura Ingraham and all that sort of thing. If you believe, as I must say I do, that there was a hand in this from the West, and there's been some suggestion that the British were involved, I don't believe that they were exclusively involved. If this was an attempt at some kind of colour revolution in Kazakhstan, what is now happening is that is failing. And it's not just failing, it is failing catastrophically. Because what is now happening is that Russian troops are entering Kazakhstan, where they weren't before. It is now turning out that the new president is going to be closer to Russia than the previous president was. And all the indications are that once this protest wave, this violent coup attempt has been defeated, Kazakhstan, like Belarus, is going to be closer integrated to Russia than it was. And where the Russians go with their troops, the Chinese follow with their suitcases full of cash. So this attempt, which is, I'm sure, what it was, to detach Kazakhstan from this emerging Eurasian system, not only looks like it's failed, but it looks like it's failed catastrophically and is achieving the opposite outcome to the one that its instigators expected. And that's why you're getting all these angry comments from people like Liz Truss and people who go on, Laura Ingraham and all the rest, because the outcome is the diametric opposite of what I think they'd hoped for and expected.
Who do you think was behind this, Alexander? What's going on here? Because Zakharova is clear in her statements. Zakharova is
absolutely,
clear
absolutely.
I mean, that believes something's at play.
I mean, that's an absolutely key point, because, of course, there's been all sorts of rumours and speculations on the Russian, in the Russian media and on the Runet, the Russian internet, that this was a foreign-inspired colour revolution attempt, an attempt by Western intelligence agencies, to put it straightforwardly, to organise a colour revolution in a key ally of Russia and China. And now the foreign ministry, in other words, the Russian government, has actually come out and said so. So, I mean, that I think tells us that the Russians, who obviously must be pretty well informed about what's been going on, that they've actually come out and said so. They've actually come out and said that there was a foreign hand in all of this. And I think, I have to say this, I mean, who else would have been involved? I cannot imagine that an operation like this could have been carried out without the involvement of the intelligence agencies of the United States. And there are rumours that the British were also involved. And there's all the usual assortment of NGOs and groups like that were also participating. And beyond them, of course, there are all the various oligarchs and people like that in the United States and in the West who fund all of these NGOs. So it's the usual regime change, democracy promotion community.
Why? Why Kazakhstan?
Well, as I said, because it's a pivot. First of all, it's got the longest border of any country, apparently, on Russia. So it's absolutely enormously, I mean, destabilizing Kazakhstan would be a very, very serious problem for Russia. But I think also the calculation was that, if you get control of Kazakhstan, you disrupt, in fact, you basically upturn the Eurasian Economic Union, of which Kazakhstan is a key member, the Russian-led Collective Security Treaty Organization, which is the military alliance the Russians have been forming, and in which, by the way, China is now an observer, and of course the Belt and Road Initiative. So it was an attempt, if you like, to disrupt and destabilize this entire process of Eurasian integration. And Kazakhstan is a key part of that, and that was the objective. What I think these people didn't understand is that it was so important that the Russians were not going to sit on their hands and let it happen. The president in Kazakhstan proved to be a rather tougher character than I think they bargained for. And besides, he would have known that the Russians and the Chinese were backing him. And, of course, the days when the Russians were too disorganized and weak to act have long since gone. If you go back in time, when there were color revolutions in Georgia in the early 2000s, in Ukraine, the so-called Orange Revolution of 2004, there's very little Russia could do in those days. Its military was in no shape to intervene. The political system in Russia was still very dysfunctional. The economy was weak and sensitive to sanctions pressure. So there was very little the Russians could do. Today, it's different. They were prepared to act. They did act decisively during the Belarus protests last year, and they've acted decisively. And by the way, at extraordinary speed this time. I mean, you are already seeing deployments of Russian airborne troops, paratroopers, to Kazakhstan. And as I said, Russian boots are already on the ground.
Yeah, I mean, during the Maidan, they let it fester for many, many months. So, I mean, it wasn't, it was a very slow moving type of regime change. And so Russian intelligence that was on the ground in Ukraine, and there's a lot of Russian intelligence on the ground in Ukraine, they were definitely asleep. But in the case of Belarus, and I believe in Kazakhstan, they have acted quickly. I mean, in a matter of 3-4 days, they've been able to stamp out most of the violence that was taking place, this uprising that was taking place. And according to the Foreign Ministry of Russia, they're saying that it was foreign influence that was pushing for this instability. But the situation in Almaty is still very tense.
Yes.
I'm reading a headline right now from Sputnik News, which says mayhem in Kazakhstan, and they're pointing to Almaty. They say police officers beheaded, stores looted, hospitals surrounded. Two final questions. The fact that you are having such things as stores looted, hospitals surrounded, and officers meeting this type of fate, I imagine this is terrible to see, especially in a city like Almaty, a big cosmopolitan city like Almaty. But it does give the government the impetus, the excuse to say this truly is a violent terrorist operation, because this is not about peaceful protests of the sort. I mean, we're seeing looting and real disgusting violence take place. So now we have to stamp it out. So that's one thing. My second point in this is maybe this isn't so much about Russia and it is more about China. Okay, you have the U.S.-Russia talks coming up soon, so that may be a reason to cause some instability. But you also have the Beijing Olympics coming up soon as well. So maybe they're killing two birds with one stone here. I don't know, but you know, if this is what we should be in for as the Olympics start to approach, then boy, we better buckle up.
Well, many good points there. Can I just first of all start with the Olympics? Bear in mind that the Maidan events in 2014 happened in the weeks leading up to the Sochi Olympics. And there have been many people who've been speculating that something similar was going to happen in the run-up to the Beijing Winter Olympics. And now we've seen it. Only this time, whereas the Russians were to some extent paralyzed by the fact that they didn't want a boycott of the Sochi Olympics, and that undoubtedly complicated their decision-making in the run-up to the events on Maidan in February 2014 in Ukraine. This time, well, the Russians have been able to act decisively and undoubtedly with a green light from Beijing, because as far as they're concerned, it's not their Olympics, and they're not going to be distracted in the same way as they were before. They've learnt that lesson. So that's the first thing to say. Now, the Russians have acted actually incredibly fast. They've not waited 3 days. What I think was holding things back, and one of the reasons why the situation yesterday deteriorated almost to the point of collapse, was because of this power struggle that was happening within the government between Nazarbayev and Tokayev. That power struggle had to be resolved first so that there could be a president firmly in control who would be able to make that formal request to the Collective Security Treaty Organization and to Russia to get the troops deployed. Now, that power struggle was resolved, and it'd be very interesting to know how. I mean, there's undoubtedly aspects to this story that we just don't know about. But the moment that power struggle was resolved, you saw action being taken very fast. So within hours, in fact. Now, coming to your second point about the violence, undoubtedly, the scale of the violence is going to cause a stiffening of support towards the government. And it will undoubtedly also justify the government describing this as an anti-terrorist operation. Now, there have been made some pretty lurid claims about beheadings and things of that kind. I'm not saying that hasn't happened. I'm only going to say is that's what the government is saying. I would like to see some corroboration. But of other forms of violence, that is indisputable. Looting undoubtedly took place on an enormous scale. We've seen lots of evidence of this. There's been a smashing of things at the airport, the fires exactly of the mayor's office, the presidential palace. Many of these protesters have been armed with assault rifles. There's been shootouts, things of this kind. So undoubtedly that reinforces the picture that this is an anti-terrorist operation, because, to be straightforward about it, some of the people who've been acting in these protests, well, these have not been peaceful protests, not by any measure at all. And that does provide justification for this type of operation. But of course, what it is also going to do is it's going to provide a swing of support behind the government, because people, when they're faced with this kind of thing, when they see public order breakdown, when they see hospitals attacked, and this is again also very well corroborated, when they see airports attacked, when they see this kind of looting take place, they want peace and order in their streets. That's universal all over the world, and they will support those who they think will provide it. So it's going to result in a strengthening of support for the government and for the current president, who's of course also the president whom the Russians are backing. So that's the second thing. The third point about China, everything that is now happening is ultimately about China. The United States has now clearly come to identify China as the major adversary. And it is China's success in building this network of alliances in Eurasia and ultimately looking as if it might gain control over the enormous natural resources in Eurasia. It is that which is spooking some people. So yes, obviously, managing to stage an effective regime change operation in a place like Kazakhstan would enormously increase the pressure on Russia, especially in advance of the talks which are due to happen between the Russians and the Americans on the 10th of January. But it is Chinese plans to build this strategic hinterland that will provide China with natural resources and make it free its dependence on seaborne imports of critical raw materials and energy through the Straits of Malacca, where they can be blockaded by the US Navy. That is what I think is spooking these people and what is ultimately behind all these events. And in fact, the Russians have acted decisively to end all of this. And you mentioned Bitcoin. Well, of course, Bitcoin is an increasingly important part of the global economy. We mustn't underestimate it. But Kazakhstan is more than just Bitcoin. It's also oil and gas. It's food. It's a major food producer. It's and could potentially be much more so. During the time of the Soviet Union, it was one of the Soviet Union's key bread baskets, and China is a major food importer. And it also supplies 40% of the world's uranium. Uranium used for power stations, nuclear bombs, all those sort of things. So it's a massively important prize. The Russians are securing it. The Chinese will have it.
Yeah. All right. We'll continue to monitor the situation because we're still not out of the woods. And
Oh no! I mean that
change.
Yes, I mean
Yeah.
I would be very surprised now if this coup now succeeded. But it's not impossible. I mean I mean it's not impossible. I mean there's still a lot of resistance, a lot of fighting, especially in Almaty, going on. But my sense is that the crisis, the critical point has now passed, and what we're gradually going to see is the government reasserting control.
Yeah, I mean, this was an insurrection. It may have started out, and I believe it probably did start out with outrage over the energy hikes, which I think we've been covering in detail from a global perspective.
Oh, absolutely. I mean,
this is to many countries. Even the UK, we mentioned it, that they have.
Absolutely.
They have a similar problem that they're going to have to face.
I mean,
with regards
ultimately,
to caps and
exactly.
Yeah.
Ultimately, this is just another. This is just another part of the global inflation crisis, which, as we have discussed many times on many programs, is a product of the economic policies of the current US administration. We've been saying that this is going to create global instability. Well, this is just the case in point.
Yeah, and when you have that instability and you have a reaction like what happened in Kazakhstan, and people do get onto the streets to protest the sudden increase in energy costs, you do run the risk that certain forces, outside forces or NGO forces as well, will hijack those protests and use them for different reasons. It's common and it happens all the time, and I think we're starting to get a clearer picture that this is probably the route that took place in Kazakhstan. And on top of that, you had a power struggle as well. So certain things had to get cleared up before we could move towards some sort of stability. But it looks like we're heading there. But there's no doubt that this was some sort of planned insurrection and coup. Yes. And we'll stop this video here, Alexander, because we're going to talk about this insurrection compared to the day is now January 6th, and supposedly an insurrection that took place in Washington, D.C., because as you were telling me before we did this video, that it would be interesting to discuss these two, let's say, case studies, these two scenarios side by side, given the day that we are in, to put forth the point that we are seeing a real insurrection now, and last year was no such thing, something totally different. So this video will end here, and we'll continue to talk about January 6th, and that will be on Locals. I'll also put it on Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, and Super U. You'll find all those links down below in the description box. So let's just jump into it and talk about what we're seeing in Kazakhstan unfold and what we saw on this very day last year, which has been called the insurrection, the DC insurrection.